Hi, and welcome to Get Lit. I'm Lisa Wrenn, and we're here today in downtown Walnut Creek Library speaking with Michelle Richmond. Michelle Richmond is the author of a book of short stories and 3 novels, most recently The Year of Fog and No One You Know. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm happy to be here.
So let's start today by talking about The Year of Fog.
Okay.
Why don't you tell, for the sake of our viewers there, tell them a little bit what the book is about.
All right. Well, The Year of Fog opens up on Ocean Beach in San Francisco on a very foggy July day, one of those summer days in the city that we all know so well, where the beach is just drenched in fog. And Abby, the narrator, who is a photographer, is there with a little girl named Emma who's 6 years old. And in a few months, Abby is going to marry Emma's father. So this is how the book opens. And in that opening chapter, Emma goes missing on the beach. So the book is about Abby's search for the child, but it's also a book about memory and about guilt and about sort of how much a relationship can take before it falls apart. Because Abby is about to marry Emma's father when this horrible tragedy happens. And it's also just a book about the city that really explores the city that I adopted as my home.
Well, you led me right into my next question, because one of the things that struck me as someone that's lived in the Bay Area my entire adult life and has spent a lot of time in San Francisco is how well you know that city. And in fact, when I was first reading it, I was thinking, wow, she must have grown up here. And then I began to realize the character, like you, had adopted the city. And how long have you, let's move over there and talk a little bit about you, because I think there's a similar theme in your other book as far as it focuses on the city, but let's talk a little bit about you adopting the city and also where you grew up. Let's start where you grew up.
Okay, so I grew up on the Gulf Coast, on Alabama's Gulf Coast, and my first 2 books were set in the Deep South. And really explored the landscape of my childhood. And I moved to San Francisco in 1999 with my husband, and we actually moved from New York City. And so when I moved to San Francisco, it instantly felt like home, really. I mean, it didn't take any time, and it felt more like home than New York did, certainly, and it felt more like the right place for me to be than Alabama ever had.
And where were you living in the city there?
Well, we moved around a bit. When we first moved to San Francisco, we lived at Diamond and Market, and I managed a little apartment building at Diamond and Market called the San Miguel. And then we moved out to Daly City, deep in the fog in Westlake, and then we moved to the outer Richmond, which is where we lived for the longest time, and we lived out by the beach at 38th and
I'm
Balboa.
seeing where you get this idea about the little girl disappearing in the fog. So you had written 2 books before, so you had some experience. You published as an author. With this one here, were you working with the same editor and the same publishing house? Well,
my experience with The Year of Fog was very different from my experience with my first 2 books, because my first book was a story collection, and it was published by University Press, and a great little press called University of Massachusetts Press, but with story collections you don't generally get a lot of distribution. My second book came out with a small San Francisco press called McAdam Cage, and so when The Year of Fog came out with Bantam, which is a division of Random House, it just sort of by luck and circumstance and timing, it had more readers by far than my other books ever had. Because I was used to sort of writing a book and not worrying who saw it, because I knew my mom would read it and maybe my sister, and that would be it. And so when The Year of Fog sort of reached a much wider audience, it was a very strange experience. And then I started getting emails back from out in the world, from strangers who had read the book and related to different parts of it. Or a lot of people would write to me and say, well, I grew up at Vicente and 24th Avenue. I would get emails from people who knew certain locations in the city, or who owned restaurants that had been mentioned in the city, and that sort of thing. And or I would get emails from people who had had an experience with the loss of a child, and so it was just really an interesting experience of sort of the community of readers.
And how much did you relate to the main character, the one who had lost her fiancés, or felt like she had lost, and you know, he felt like she had lost his daughter.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, at the time, one of the questions that I hear most often about the book is, how did you write the book? Because you have a child. So how could you bear to write about this loss of a child? And the fact is, when I wrote the book, I didn't have a child yet. I was not yet a mother, and I've often said that if I had, I probably wouldn't have written the book.
Really?
So I came to it more from the perspective of someone who had children in my life, nieces, who were very important to me. And so Abby is the child's stepmother. And I felt that I was able to sort of, for me, that emotional experience of caring very much about children who are not your own was very close to my own personal experience. And I think that definitely made it into the book. I'm not a photographer, but my younger sister is, and so she helped me with a lot of the photography details in the book. Abby does share, the book is not autobiographical at all, except for the fact that Abby does share my geographical background.
Okay.
She, like me, she grew up on the Gulf Coast, and like me, she ultimately found her home in San Francisco. And there's actually one scene, while the book is entirely fictional, there's one scene that's straight from real life. And it's a flashback to when Abby visited San Francisco with her family when she was 13 years old, and she took the ferry to Alcatraz and did all the tourist things and was dressed inappropriately because she thought it was summer in California and she was freezing. But on that trip, she fell in love with the city and decided, I'm going to live in San Francisco one day. That definitely happened to me in exactly that way when I was 13 years old, and it took me a couple decades to get to, well, maybe 15 years then to get to San Francisco, but
that was really interesting. Well, it's interesting you mentioned your sister as well, because you know the relationship between sisters, of course, is the theme of your other book, and that would be No One You Know. Why don't you talk a little bit about that book now?
Okay. Well, so No One You Know it opens 20 years after the death of the narrator's sister. The narrator is named Ellie Enderlin, and she's a coffee buyer in San Francisco. And she travels the world, you know, looking for the best coffee. And she grew up in Noe Valley, and her sister, who is a math prodigy at Stanford, was murdered when she was a student. And the murder was never solved, but a sort of true crime book was written about her sister's death. And this book really sensationalized her sister's death and sort of pointed to someone who the writer thought was the obvious candidate to be the murderer. And so that book and the story it told about Ellie and her sister's life sort of in some ways directed the path of her life. So as the book opens, she runs into the supposed murderer down in South America where she's on a coffee buying trip, and she realizes that the story she's always believed about her sister's death that was put forward in this true crime book may not be true at all. And so she then decides, she embarks on this journey to find out what really happened to her sister.
Well, it really is a mystery.
Yeah,
that
it is.
But not in sort of the traditional formulaic way that oftentimes you read a mystery. I'm intrigued by the idea of the main character being a cupper or a coffee buyer. And how did you choose that as the profession?
That's a great question. So I always do a lot of research for my books, and so with The Year of Fog, I did a lot of research about photography and about the city and about memory, because The Year of Fog focuses a lot on how valid our memories are and how we sort of create or confabulate memories. With No One You Know, the sister, I knew that the sister who had died was a mathematician, so I knew I was going to have to do some research about math, which was really painful for me because my son is 7, he's in 1st grade, and honestly, this sadly is not a joke. Like, he'll bring home homework that I don't understand, you know, with number lines that I don't understand. And so I had to do research into mathematics for this book, and I knew that whatever the narrator's profession was, I wanted it to be something where I would really love the research. And there's nothing in this world I love more, aside from possibly my child and books, than coffee. Okay. So that's kind of how, I thought, well, I need something where the narrator can travel the world and go to places that are a little bit unsettled, but where places that she's a little bit familiar with, but where the location is can put her a little bit out of her comfort zone. And I also wanted it to be something that was very sensory oriented and something that I enjoy researching. So I went to a coffee warehouse and roaster and importer in South City and did a lot of cupping and just learning about, just these warehouses filled with coffee beans. They're like paradise, massive sacks and
they
sacks.
They smell really good.
Oh, they smell so good. And I have never recovered from the research for that book. I have to say, I drank so much coffee while I was writing it because it was justifiable, and I've never decreased.
And I know you walked in today with a cup of coffee, and you had been hoping to have found one of our local
right.
coffee stores.
That's
are you
true.
a supporter of local independent coffee stores?
Absolutely, yes. So in San Francisco, the store that was closest to me was Simple Pleasures Cafe on Balboa, and it's in the book.
Okay, right.
And Reverie, I think, is also in the book. There are a few Blue Bottle is in the book.
Right.
There are a few local, because I really believe in small local shops, and they bring so much to the community in terms of gathering places and places where conversations take place. So
what were you drinking today?
Just coffee.
Just coffee.
You know what I learned? This is what I learned from my research, is that if it's good, you don't put stuff in it. The sugar, of course we don't think of coffee this way now because it's such a sort of a boutique experience, your $5 latte, but if it's really good coffee, you shouldn't disguise it with milk and sugar. If it's not very good, then go ahead and doctor it up.
Right, latte.
Yeah.
Some macchiato, some caramel,
put some
chocolate in it. Okay.
Some salt, whatever. Yeah.
Okay, good. So, what about your writing routine? You get up in the morning and you make a cup of coffee?
A large pot of coffee.
Okay.
And so the mornings I'm with my son, and then I take my son to school, and after I come home from taking him to school, then I sit down and start working. Now, of course, I wish that my routine were much more focused than it is, because when I say I sit down and start working, a lot of times I'm answering emails, or there's something pressing that my publisher is asking for, or some contract I need to deal with. So, but ideally, when I get home from taking him to school, I'll write for maybe 3 or 4 hours.
How do you keep yourself focused from the distraction? Because I know that's an ongoing issue for journalists, certainly, but I would imagine I don't think anybody in life, unless they choose to go and turn off the ghosting up of their emails or whatever, it's very difficult to stay focused. How do you do that?
Well, I don't do it well. I used to be much better at it. What I used to do was I would go away for a month every summer, and I would take my summers off from teaching, and for 1 month I would be, for example, in Costa Rica. There's a writers colony there. I did a writers colony upstate New York, one on an island off of Seattle, Whidbey Island. So for 1 month every year, I would be in a place where I couldn't easily use the phone, and where I couldn't easily use the internet, and so I could write for 12 hours at a stretch. And then during the rest of the time, it would be early morning writing. Now I think so many other things get in the way, but it's mainly if I'm really enjoying a book that I'm writing, it's easy to spend every available hour writing it if I'm really enjoying it. And that usually happens at the beginning of a book. So once I get to the middle of a book, it's much harder to focus. But one thing that does bring me into focus is, the call from my agent saying, your editor's wondering where your book is, your editor's wondering how your progress is, and that generally helps snap me back into it.
Well, and also it occurs to me, in addition to the sort of the electronic distractions we have, you're also juggling this with raising you have one son?
Yes, one son.
And how has that changed you as a writer?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think right after I had my son, what it did was made me much more efficient with the time that I did have, because suddenly my time shrunk, because I couldn't be up all night writing, or have an afternoon to write. And so what it did was you know, if I had an hour in a library or an hour, sometimes I would just drive up and down Ocean Beach in the Jeep with my son in the car seat to make him fall asleep. Right. And when he fell asleep, I would pull into the parking lot at Ocean Beach and I would write, you know. And so if I had half an hour, I tended to be able to focus better during that small span of time because there was so much that just needed to get out. So I think, I mean, in any profession, I think this thing that they call mommy brain actually is something that helps you to focus more because you know that just around the corner you're not going to have any time. Right. But I do think it's when you write when you have maybe 30 minutes to write instead of 4 hours to write, there is sort of a fracturing process that goes on with your writing, and then you're sort of trying to build all those things together right. into a complete narrative. So that would be that's a very interesting topic for a very long essay, which it's something I think about all the time. But
well, are you working on a book now?
I am. I have finished this book, I think, but you know, whether or not my publisher thinks I've finished it, I don't know yet. We will see. It's a book that's set in San Francisco. It takes place in one day in San Francisco, and the narrator is from the South once again, but this time she's from rural Mississippi, which is where my parents grew up. Okay. And so, and she's a doctor, and I've really enjoyed writing the book, and I'm really ready to be finished with it. I'm so ready that I've started a new book, just because the starting is always so much more fun than the revising and the rising and revising. Yeah.
What is that process when you're writing a novel? Do you ship off chapters and chapters at a time, or do you wait till the whole thing is done and hand it over and then go back for revises?
I wait till it's all done. Okay. I do not like, I mean, I have friends who are part of writing groups and who really love that feedback. For me, that's just sort of disastrous. My husband, whom I met in graduate school we were both in an MFA together in creative writing. He's my first reader. He reads everything I write, and he'll read it as I go along. He won't, you know, it doesn't mean he reads every chapter, but you know, every couple months he'll usually, you know, read a draft of what I'm working on, and before it ever goes off to my agent and editor, he sees it. And I like to have a complete manuscript before I send it to my editor. Right. But you know, deadlines being what they are, I mean, before all the way through the writing of The Year of Fog, I never had a deadline for anything because I never wrote a book on contract. I wrote a book and then tried to get a publisher. And then I was on contract for Know When You Know, and I'm on contract for this book and the next one. So there are deadlines, you know, where someone is asking you for something. And so what does happen sometimes is I'll end up sending a draft before I really want someone to see the draft. But, you know, that's the way it works. Unfortunately, I've been lucky to have a very good editor. So,
what is well, you've sort of answered it. What's the hardest part about writing? What is the part about writing that surprises you the most?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I don't know. I mean, the thing about writing that gives me joy is you're writing something and because writing is all about association, and an association pops up that you weren't expecting, and the association might come from a color or a place or a word or anything, and this association pops up and then it opens up an entire new avenue in your writing, or it opens up an entire new avenue in the book, a place you hadn't expected to go, and it opens up some sort of metaphorical possibility. And so for me, those associations are where the surprise comes in, whether you're writing a story or an essay or a novel, and that's always the greatest pleasure of writing, is when that happens. Yeah.
I'm making a leap here, but when you were growing up, were you a reader?
Yes, I was, but you know, it's interesting. So we had a huge family Bible, you know, the big white Bible with the scary pictures, and we weren't allowed to watch, you know, anything. on TV. I mean, we watched TV, but it was the most G-rated TV you can imagine. And we weren't allowed to go to movies because they were all too dirty. But we had this massive Bible with the kind that had all this, you know, bright, full color, frightening photographs with naked people and battles. And so I read that endlessly, and I even remember the typography and the drop caps. It was just sort of this fascinating book, and it was so strange that we had these very violent and often risque stories on the coffee table when we were not allowed to, you know, watch whatever, you know, Charlie's Angels, but my mother always read to me, and my grandparents in rural Mississippi had this collection that they had been getting, I guess, for years and years, of Reader's Digest condensed books. Now, of course, now as an author, I think, what is a condensed book? How can anyone condense a book? Right. That seems, you know, sacrilegious almost, but I loved my grandparents' Reader's Digest condensed books, and I just remember going down to house in Brookhaven, Mississippi, and I would just sit there and pour through these books, and my grandmother would let me take them home with me. And it seems like at that time in the 70s, like late 70s and early 80s, they were already old books, and they already smelled like old books, and they were so wonderful, you know.
Did you have a local library?
I did.
Did your mother think it was, or parents let you go to the library?
We were allowed to go to the library,
okay.
Yes. My branch was called the Cottage Hill branch of the library in Mobile, Alabama. And I remember what it looked like, and I remember, you know, walking in and the stacks on the left. It was, I mean, it's not like these amazing libraries we have in Northern California. It was very small, you know, very small, sort of in a strip mall. Nothing like what we have around us here in the Walnut Creek Downtown Library, but it still had that sense of, you know, that sense of promise and possibility. And when my son was young and we were in the outer Richmond, we used the Anza branch of the library and the Richmond branch of the library. And it's wonderful just going in, and I mean, every library that I know, that I seem to see in the Bay Area, has it's very dedicated children's section, right, with a little children's room and little seats for children, and it's wonderful with my son. And now we use the San Mateo Library and the Burlingame Library. It's wonderful going into the children's rooms and just watching your child just go through with utter abandon, just choosing one book and looking and reading. Oh, I want this one, and choosing another. Oh, I want this one. And so I have a great respect and love for libraries. And I should say that I wrote. When I had to revise The Year of Fog for publication after it was acquired, I did a good bit of that in the Burlingame Library because I needed a place to work, and that was a good place to be.
Well, and why was the library a good place to work?
Because it's quiet,
okay.
And because being surrounded by books, and because you can't get up and make coffee, you can't get up and get ice cream, you can't go outside for a walk because you know your computer and your stuff is set up there. So I used, there were a few libraries, but at the time, I mean, my in-laws live in Burlingame, so I would be down there sometimes, and I would use that library. But I also used my neighborhood library to write. And after I had my son, I would my husband would be home with him, and I would go sometimes to our little library to write. Right. So yeah.
Well, you're describing your writing your own book in the library gives me an idea. It makes me realize the folks you sometimes see over there on their laptops or down there on their laptops, perhaps they are also penning best-selling novels.
They might very well be.
Who knows? I did also want to mention that both of these books here, which I have at home but I forgot to bring, they are available in the Walnut Creek Library, so if you would like to read them for yourself, they are right here. And one more note, I remember in the book in The Year of Fog, there is a librarian, and her name is Nell.
There is.
Tell me about Nell.
Well, the way the librarian Nell made it into the book was I had all this stuff about memory, these case studies about memory that I found really interesting, like a fellow named Sharefsky who could not forget. You know, we often think of memory problems as being someone who can't remember something, right, short-term, long-term memory loss. But there's a character who couldn't remember anything that he had ever seen, heard, done, felt. And so, And there were a few case studies like this in the book, and I was trying to figure out how to introduce them in an organic way. Like, why would the narrator have access to this information? And I thought, oh, her next door neighbor is a librarian. Okay. So Nell works at the Mechanics Institute Library in San Francisco, and she brings her, when the narrator, Abby, starts sort of trying to go into her own memory to figure out what might have happened that day at Ocean Beach in order to find clues to where Emma might be. Nell starts bringing her home little pieces, little articles here and there about memory. And so Nell plays a pretty important role in the book as sort of an avenue for this information that begins to lead somewhere. Yeah.
Thank you again for joining us today, and thank you for joining us here at Get Lit on Walnut Creek Television. Join us again next time.